Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents, the last episode of Cognitive Dissidents for the year 2022. As usual, I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm your host. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast is John Minnich. John is a PhD candidate in international relations and comparative politics at MIT, where he focuses on China. But more importantly, John is one of my best friends. We were roommates in college together and go back a long way. And there's nobody whose insights I trust more on China. So, John, thanks for making some time for coming on. This is a really, really rich episode, I think. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year, any holidays that you're celebrating that I'm not aware of. I hope that they are meaningful and full of light and warmth. And otherwise, thanks for making 2022 such a successful year for this podcast. The growth this year has been absolutely incredible, and we're hoping to double down on it next year, and it wouldn't happen without all of y'all's support. So thank you so much for being along with us on the ride and giving us this platform and trusting us to update you on what's going on in the world, and we will keep pushing forward. So cheers, take good care, stay safe. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. John, it's nice to welcome a gent onto this version of the podcast for the first time. I think you came on the Perch Pod once upon a time.
I was. Yeah, it's great to be here.
We were supposed to record last week, and I haven't actually told you this, no joke. It wasn't just that I canceled on you because the power went out, but then during the slot where we were actually supposed to record, there was a tornado warning in downtown New Orleans. They said there was a tornado coming down the street from my house. It ended up not. It ended up being a couple of minutes away. But I literally, instead of recording with you, I was sitting in the closet with my father-in-law and the 3-month-old trying to ride out the tornado. So now It's just cold. There's not a storm outside.
Okay. Well, hey, I'm glad we're able to do it.
Look, you will have forgotten more about China than I'll probably ever learn in my lifetime. So it's really nice to have you on the podcast. We can start at sort of at the most abstract level, or go down to the nitty gritty. I've read some of your papers and stuff like that, but I guess cool. We're recording here on December 20th. This will publish in about a week. But I guess I wonder how you're feeling about China in 2023, because it feels like, Xi Jinping is now emperor for real. We've got this real estate crisis. Is it serious? Is it not? We've got this COVID-19 reopening. Are millions of people going to die? Are they not? It feels like there's so much in flux about China going in the year ahead and so much uncertainty. So I just wonder, from your kind of perspective, how do you feel about China going into 2023? Is it a good year, a bad year? Or are you just as confused as everybody else?
I guess I would start by saying I think it will be a better year than 2022, but that's a pretty low bar. I mean, 2022 was a really, really rough year for China, but I think 2023 will be better in a couple of respects. One, even though I think that there's a lot about the 180 turn that the Chinese government has taken on COVID in the past couple of weeks, that definitely, you can't characterize it as anything other than a massive failure of governance and policy. There are really huge problems with what they've done. Nonetheless, given that they've decided to just let COVID rip through the Chinese population, I think that we're probably going to be in a situation where by mid-February or March, most of China's population, 60 or 70% of the population, will have had COVID. And so we'll be through the worst of it, pending, assuming, barring kind of emergence of new variants that then continue to circulate and, creates an ongoing wave in China. And if that's the case, then I think that what we'll see is, in the short term, by the middle of next year, some semblance of a temporary economic recovery that'll generate a lot of positive news and buzz around China. And so we'll have a sense that things are going better. Of course, all of the same underlying structural problems will still be there, but the one basic issue that we're not going to be going through endless cycles of lockdowns. I think that will be a major improvement. I think that the other thing too that we are likely to see is, and we already see some indications of this, is a general softening of China's diplomatic stance and diplomatic position. And I think real concerted efforts by Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership to tack a different direction in terms of China's relations with the U.S. And of course, I think, again, this isn't going to change that much substantively, because I think the U.S. is an utterly ruthless great power and will continue to do whatever it can to stall and roll back China's economic and technological rise. I mean, that is where we are with U.S. policy towards China on a fundamental level. But I think at least we're going to see a movement towards stabilization of relations, towards, creating avenues of communication between the two sides diplomatically. And all of that's going to be basically good. So I think in that sense, 2023 will be better than 2022. But of course, I think a better 2023 maybe also means that 2024, 2025, 2026 will be harder in different ways, because again, the same underlying problems are still going to be there. And I don't think we're going to see them really addressed in a fundamental way next year. And this is like with things like real estate and debt levels and so forth.
Yeah. Well, so if that's kind of the case, like if you feel like China is going to continue to soften diplomatically, I agree with you that the U.S. is going to continue to be ruthless about this. Like, how long can China continue to be soft diplomatically? Because I feel like China is going to try and be nice, and like the United States is not taking its. Well, maybe it will. Maybe the United States will take its foot off the gas pedal. Maybe the Biden White House will be so concerned about inflation that they'll want to make some kind of temporary trade truce with China. Is that a realistic scenario at all? Or I'm just wondering how China is going to react if it does open up, or if it does soften diplomatically, and the United States is just like, yeah, that's nice, but we're going to continue to kneecap every single company that you have that has any standing in the world.
Yeah, no, this is a great point. And this is where I think, again, it's kind of, projecting this out beyond 2023, just because things move relatively slowly. So I don't know that we're going to see, 2023, I think will be in the up cycle. And then I think that things will probably, go down from there, because, and this is where in the long run, I'm really concerned about what's going to happen between China and the US, because I don't really see, I think we're just in a situation now where the US as the, declining hegemon, or as the established great power, however we want to characterize it, I think the U.S. has come to the conclusion that China's continued economic and technological rise poses a fundamental threat to the U.S. supremacy, to the U.S. dominant position in the global system. And I think that the U.S. is taking, concerted, systematic efforts to cut off China's access to critical inputs and to its continued technological rise. And I think that that's not going to change. And China, will find itself in a position of calculating, basically, does it take more extreme measures now to confront the U.S. and possibly forestall it's a decline that would happen by having its access to these critical resources. Here I just made advanced semiconductors and other chips cut off. Or does China somehow, suck it up and take the hit and then just kind of continue to pursue self-reliance? But this is not really a realistic goal when it comes to most parts of the semiconductor supply chain anywhere in the near future. So I see all kinds of reasons for concern. And I think there are, in the long run, actually, I think sort of thinking structurally, both in terms of the export control issue and in terms of Taiwan. And this is where I see just really serious continued risks if the Republicans are in charge in the House and the Republicans are sending CODELs to Taiwan, and we see a re-escalation of tensions there. I think there are a lot of reasons to think that, how does this not end up in war? So in the long run, I see those as real possibilities. But nonetheless, I think 2023 will be, a somewhat stabler year, because I think that this is a year also where we're going to see the Chinese leadership's priorities massively shifting inward. And historically, it's been the case that when China is trying to deal with internal problems, that leads to more concessionary policies in terms of foreign policy. So in China, we don't generally see, the one kind of kind of folk theory would be that governments use, launching foreign wars to create a rally around the flag effect to patch over domestic instability. But in fact, in China, we see generally the opposite. It's at times when they are focused on internal problems that they then make concessions on territorial disputes and on, they basically take steps to soften their diplomatic environment to basically give them breathing space so that they can then focus more internally. And I think that we're going to see something like that happening in 2023. And I think part of this also is because, and of course, it's been the case for every year since 2011 or so, we've kind of wondered, will this be the year when China finally tackles its internal structural economic problems, that it finally, takes the steps to reduce reliance on real estate investment and to increase consumption and all of these different things. And of course, not that I expect that 2023 is going to be a big bang year where they actually accomplish all of these things, but if we think that China's leaders are basically rational and they're responding to structural incentives and constraints, then I think surely this will be the year where they begin to take more concerted steps to address their internal economic problems. And that almost like kind of mechanically, I think, is going to mean a softening and attempts to soften the external environment.
The way you characterize the U.S. perception of China as this threat to U.S., I think that's exactly right. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think it depends on how I think there are probably like two ways to break this apart, kind of break the U.S. We can disaggregate the U.S. perception of China into two things. One is capabilities and one is intentions. And I would say in terms of capabilities, yes, fundamentally, I think it is the case that even though China has not caught up to the U.S. in many different discrete sectors, in aggregate, I think that the delta in China's economic and technological capabilities over the last 2 decades has been genuinely extraordinary. And so I think just from a perspective of the U.S. looking out, looking at a world where we went from a situation of very, very clear, incontestable unipolarity, where the U.S. was far and away the most powerful state in the system. And 20 years later, we can look and that situation has fundamentally changed, and the U.S. is definitely no longer clearly the most powerful state in the system. And there are certain areas, and also given just the fact that China has a much narrower portfolio than the U.S. does. The U.S. is tasked with providing global security. China really just needs to focus on maritime East Asia and its land borders. So I think that in terms of material capabilities, there's been a meaningful shift, and it's been a relative downward shift for the U.S. and a relative upward shift for China. But I don't think that the more hawkish or aggressive U.S. characterizations of China's intentions are necessarily fair or accurate. So, one of the, there's a book that's very influential in American policy circles now when it comes to China called The Long Game. And it's a pretty smart book. And basically what the author of this book is trying to do, his name is Rush Doshi, and he's actually in the U.S. government now. And what he's trying to do in this book is make a case that China has been pursuing a consistent and coherent grand strategy for the past 40 years. And that grand strategy has several different components, but that we are now in the sort of final stage of that grand strategy, which is displacement of the U.S. as the dominant power in the world system. And he tries to marshal textual evidence from Chinese central government policy documents to make this case, I think not entirely successfully. I think it's just not clear from what Chinese leaders have said, from the information they've put out there, that China has intentions to revise the status quo anything beyond reclaiming Taiwan, essentially, and creating something like a modest sphere of influence within East Asia. I don't think that China right now has any interest in becoming the dominant power in the world system. So I think in that sense, American readings of Chinese intentions are vastly overblown for basically political reasons, because we need to mobilize budgets and we need to mobilize, resources. And also think American policymakers see China as one of the few issues. By creating China as a big other, it's one of the few issues that we can build some actual kind of bipartisan consensus inside the U.S. around. And so, I get that, like from American policymakers' rational incentives, that totally makes sense. But I think it's not a fair characterization of China's interests or China's intentions. And ultimately, it makes the situation much more dangerous. But of course, the response you can make to that is that China's intentions are part and parcel with its material capabilities. And so as China becomes even more powerful, if it were to become even more powerful, its interests would expand in turn. And China would take on more expensive interests in the same way that the U.S. did. That China is, in this sense, fundamentally no different from the U.S. As the U.S.'s material capabilities grew, its vision of what it could and should do in the world system also grew. So in this sense, it's not an entirely unfair reading And again, I think because the U.S., like all other great powers in history, is utterly ruthless in pursuing its interests vis-a-vis China, it makes sense that it's doing what it is. Of course, it also just means that we're entering, it's making the situation worse, and it's making the world we live in more dangerous.
Yeah, I guess the thing there, though, is that like the United States was in a defensive posture when it assumed that position. Like it didn't go invade Europe in World War I. It didn't go invade the Pacific like during World War II. We like came in charging at the end, and just because of our geographical advantages, like we did kind of well. Like I don't expect that even as China's power grows, that we're going to see, you know, the People's Liberation Army Navy like in the Gulf of Mexico, like blockading the port of New Orleans. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you think
no. I think you're making. I mean, I think that's absolutely true when it comes to the U.S. in terms of U.S. as the guarantor of global security. But where I think the U.S. did behave in ways that you know, are consistent with what we might see China is that the U.S., you know, manifests destiny in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. I mean, once the U.S. got a certain level of material capabilities, it said to the, you know, powers of the old world, this is our territory. Don't F with us, you know, like we control this. And of course, throughout the 20th century, we were, again, utterly ruthless in maintaining our total supremacy of the Western Hemisphere. And I think that is basically the extent of China's interest too. I mean, I think that China, in an ideal case scenario, it probably would like to exert the same kind of hegemony in East Asia that the U.S. does in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, that's simply not possible because in East Asia, China is ringed by, you know, countries that are one, American allies, and two, are vastly larger industrial powers than any other country in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
So
it's one thing if you're the Rough Riders and you're rolling through Cuba. It's like another thing if you've got Vietnam on one level and like the Philippines is over here and all that other kind of stuff.
But one point I would just make though about sort of thinking about the U.S.'s global position after World War II. I mean, yes, in many ways we stumbled into this, and the reason the U.S. was equivalent to half the world economy in 1946 was because the other half of the world economy had destroyed itself. So that wasn't exactly the U.S.'s. I mean, the U.S. wasn't behaving as a grand imperial power. Nonetheless, in the decades after World War II, we maintained over 100,000 troops in Europe, and we maintained some 50 to 70,000 troops in Japan and South Korea. And we did continue to administer these regions as, in many ways, imperial protectorates of the American empire. I mean, and that was that's a kind of, and of course we did that defensively vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union collapsed and we maintained most of those forces in both of those regions, or a very sizable chunk of them. So, I mean, we've also behaved more offensively than I think the kind of mainstream American conventional wisdom might like to think. Yeah,
no, I mean, China has a legitimate bone to pick there. Like the quote unquote Korean War became a U.S.-China war because MacArthur charged, you know, he wanted more than just the Korean Peninsula.
No, that's one of the, I mean, of course it makes sense because it took place on the Korean Peninsula, but that is absolutely one of the most misleadingly named wars in 20th century history. I mean, it was the first U.S.-China war in many respects.
That's what I've been calling it too. Have you read much about MacArthur? Do you have a view on him?
So what I know about MacArthur is actually what I remember from, I believe, the third volume of the LBJ biographies, the description of MacArthur when Truman forced him to resign. He came to the U.S. and Robert Caro in Master of the Senate describes how MacArthur did this kind of victory lap through Washington, and it was like the one moment in American history where the traditional kind of taken for granted civilian control of the military kind of broke down, and it was like this one moment where we actually could have had something like a military coup because people were just totally fawning over him. So I know that, and of course I know MacArthur in Japan, and you know, seems like a fascinating character, but I don't know much about him beyond that.
Yeah, and the other great thing about the Caro thing too is he spends all that time building up Richard Russell as like this, Southern terrible leader of the segregationists and stuff like that. But it's Richard Russell who like holds back the dam against MacArthur. And I don't know. I used to get into huge fights with George of all people about MacArthur because he loved MacArthur and thought that like what MacArthur did in Korea was incredible and thought that he was the best U.S. commander or general or whatever in World War II. And I'm like halfway through Manchester's big biography of MacArthur, and my only thoughts are that dude is weird. He is so varied and so brilliant and yet vain at the same time. It's like really hard to parse. But I don't know. I spent a lot of time thinking lately whether U.S.-China relations would have been different if Douglas MacArthur wasn't the one in Japan or in Korea and the Korean War hadn't happened that particular way. But before we get down that rabbit hole, sort of picking up on something you were saying before about China being ringed by, U.S. allies or other countries that are stronger than countries in the Western Hemisphere. And you already alluded to unipolarity. I think one of the things I'm struggling with the most right now, sort of on a long-term perspective, is the world moving bipolar with like the U.S. and China having a Cold War, or is it multipolar and China is just one country among a number of several countries that are going to have spheres of influence? Is Japan going to have its sphere? And you can kind of build it out from there. Do you feel like, and I guess you can ask that question on two levels. Do you think at a global level we're headed towards bipolar U.S.-China war? And then even in East Asia itself, is it like the U.S. versus China? Or is it really, no, there's the U.S. and China, but like Japan's doing stuff over here. And if Korea ever unified, Korea would be doing stuff too. And like Indonesia's a sleeping giant. Like how do you think about kind of the structure of the balance of power of the region right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, part of the problem with this is that we are limited by history. We only have kind of like one run of the experiment of modern human history. So we haven't been able to run this multiple times to have like different examples of bipolar orders. So obviously when we think of bipolarity, we always go back to the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And this next thing, whatever it is, will not be precisely like that. That was characterized by, it was a really unique situation where partly because Europe and Japan had been, one, first devastated industrially and economically, and then were constitutionally prohibited from rebuilding militarily during this period. So you had this like really fascinating kind of aggregation effect where everything was about these two powers and every minor conflict immediately aggregated up to one of those two powers because there were no other independent centers of power and authority, except, maybe kind of at the margins. You had some countries in the Middle East and other places acting with like some degree of independence, but even so totally constrained by the geopolitical dynamic caused by the balance of power between these two countries. So I think certainly what we see going forward will be different from that. I think we can say on some rough level, it is quote unquote bipolar in the sense that you are going to have two countries that are substantially more powerful than any other country. Like the gap between China and the US will be much smaller than the gap between China and the US on the one hand and everyone else on the other. And so that, in a sense, will have characteristics of bipolarity, but again, going to be really different because, and of course, it is important to remember that even though countries like Japan and Germany are, Japan, and especially now Japan going to boost military spending, Japan already is and will be a more capable and more meaningful independent military actor in its own right. Germany also, in many ways, as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, these are economies that are, at this point, I think, roughly 1/4 to 1/5 the size of the Chinese economy and 1/6 to 1/7 the size of the U.S. economy. They're considerably smaller than the Chinese and U.S. economies, and their war machines are correspondingly smaller. Although, of course, quality matters now in a way that it didn't 70 years ago. So I think that there's like a real meaningful sense in which, we're approaching something like bipolarity, but it's not going to be, our grandfather's bipolarity. It's going to be a different kind of bipolarity. And within that, you are going to have things like multipolar dynamics. And part of that is because you're going to have multiple nuclear powers that also each of them in their own right lay claim to something like great power status or at least major power status. And definitely, I think that I think another thing too that we're going to see is because relatively speaking, I would expect that the US's power and predominance is not going to increase that much. And I think that the US's ability to sustain a global military and security presence is going to decline, relatively speaking. And so I think that the US will find itself outsourcing more and more of this work to its regional partners and allies like Japan and Germany, or the European Union generally. And so in that sense, it's going to create dynamics of multipolarity. So I would say it's like a little bit of both. And of course, that makes it probably in a lot of ways more dangerous than the Cold War 1.0, because at least international relations theorists tend to think that bipolarity is a relatively stable form of order, precisely because all conflicts aggregate up into a, total showdown between the two powers, and that exerts a kind of deterrent effect on any form of major conflict. Like, that's why you had the US and the Soviet Union so laser focused on finding opportunities for strategic stability, because they were deathly afraid of any kind of conflict aggregating up into all-out world war. But if we have multipolarity, where it's a conflict between the US and Japan doesn't necessarily bring in, or between China and Japan doesn't necessarily bring in the US, that creates a different dynamic, or where a conflict in the East China Sea or the South China Sea doesn't necessarily bring in the US, it's a different dynamic. So
I imagine
that's pessimistic.
I imagine geopolitical analysts, I hear you about bipolarity maybe being more stable, but I imagine if you were a geopolitical analyst in, say, Chile, Vietnam, Congo, Lebanon, you might beg to differ with
well, this is where I think we have to make a distinction between stability at a system level and something like peaceful. I mean, bipolarity is definitely not peaceful, and a lot of people died in very hot wars during the long Cold War. But in retrospect, it seems to be the case that, generally speaking, it was structurally fairly stable. Although, of course, that's somewhat belied by the fact that we now know in retrospect that there were all of these super, super near misses where actually the world we almost destroyed the world. And it was
I feel like it was nuclear weapons, not bipolarity, that actually prevented
Good point. But then you could make an argument that nuclear weapons in a truly multipolar global order creates a different dynamic. So it's a combination of nuclear weapons and bipolarity. I'm not sure that like nuclear weapons in a world with 10 great powers is also equally safe as nuclear weapons in a world with 2 great powers. But good point. The nuclear revolution played a massive role in stabilizing that dynamic too.
Drilling down a little bit into stuff that I know is sort of in your research bailiwick right now, and I guess I'll start with another broad question, and then I wanted to dig into a couple interesting things in that paper that you sent me. I feel like everybody and their mother has discovered semiconductors in the last 6 to 8 months or something like that. It's like entered the zeitgeist in a way that, geopolitical nerds like you and me, we've been talking about semis for years, but like now everybody understands, oh, my dishwasher didn't arrive off the boat because like it needs a chip, or my car isn't here on the lot because it needs this chip, and that comes from China, and semiconductor supply chains are totally screwed. And one thing I saw Marco Papich actually say the other day, who's a frequent guest on this podcast, he sort of made the point that that maybe people are making too much of China's dependence on cutting edge chips. That China can't make cutting edge chips itself, but it doesn't need 3 nanometer chips in order to have most of the economy functioning. So they won't have the fastest self-driving cars, but as long as they can do whatever it is, 28 nanometers or 14 nanometers, I don't know what they're going to be able to do on their own. Like, they're going to be fine. And we're putting way too much emphasis on this very, very small portion of semiconductors that don't actually matter that much, even when you're fighting wars. It's all like the wars of the future and AI and great power competition in the 2030s. Do you think that's right? Or or from your perspective, has China bet on more advanced semis in a way that like they can't make some of the economic pivots they want to if we really do deny them access to ASML machines, for example, like that? Like, how do you benchmark how serious some of these semiconductor restrictions are on China's economic goals?
I would say I think I think our evaluation of the seriousness of the export controls as a constraint on China's trajectory depends to some extent on how much we want to bet on the importance of AI going forward. So I think if we take the really bullish case on AI, that we're looking at, we are, with things like ChatGPT and whatnot, we are on the edge of a total transformation of the human experience. and of what society and economy means and can do. And that AI is poised to just take off exponentially, which it might well be. I'm not an expert on AI, but that's a possibility. And I think if that's your expectation, that really it could be the case that in 5 or 10 years, we are living in a world where every single device is hyper intelligent, hyper connected, and all of this, and that just the world is unrecognizable from the one that we currently live in even. Then I think, yes, these export controls really do matter, because where the export controls hit is in the highest end chips without which you cannot run the most advanced AI algorithms. And these are chips that cost individually like well over $100 million to design and fabricate. I mean, these are just ridiculously powerful chips that at this point, basically only NVIDIA and maybe a handful of other companies can even design. And then of course, only TSMC at this point, and maybe Samsung can fabricate using, of course, machines produced only by ASML, and various other kinds of semiconductor manufacturing equipment that it's, and the list goes on. So I think that, if your expectation is that AI is going to be fundamental to the economy in the next couple of years, or maybe 5 to 10 years at the long end of things, then yeah, I think that these, what it will do is it could potentially really fundamentally stall China's economic, not its economic growth in the near term, but its ability to make that dramatic structural transformation. But, I think the reality is probably that AI won't live up to those expectations, at least in the near term. I think that we're probably further out from that kind of world than kind of the most optimistic prognostications in Wired magazine suggest. At the same time, I mean, AI is really important for a lot of military functions. And again, this is not my area of expertise in terms of exactly what level of AI capabilities are needed to, do kind of the most advanced military things like drone swarms and whatnot. But I think you can make a real case that these export controls definitely are not meaningless. I mean, they really do matter. And I think in the short to medium term, really will constrain the development of China's capabilities. But I would agree with Marco that nonetheless, the vast majority of chips input into the Chinese economy aren't anywhere near this level. The vast majority of chips are at the 28 nanometer mode, or the 14 nanometer node. And actually 14 nanometer is also really, really advanced still. Yeah. I mean, we have to remember it was like just in, I think 2017 or 2018 when 14 nanometers was the cutting edge, so I mean, that's just how quickly these things are moving.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, there's a tremendous amount that China can still do. And I don't think that the export controls as they currently are in place are going to prevent China from taking a lead in, extending its lead in electric vehicles. I mean, there are a lot of other industries that do rely on chips, but don't rely on AI chips, and that can utterly transform the world. And these are the industries where China is pushing further and further ahead, advanced manufacturing of different kinds. And so, I think, and this is where, I think we can be a little bit more optimistic about China's chances, because I think there are other industries where China is going to leap ahead and probably will be able to create bottlenecks that will reciprocally hurt the U.S. and give China points of leverage over the U.S. that maybe will even things out. But so it's like somewhere halfway between. Like, I don't think this is a death knell for China's technological rise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The conspiracy theorist in me wants to think that maybe China put so much emphasis on the 2025 plan on AI because they know they don't need AI to 2025. And it's like, hey, restrict all this AI stuff, but cede all the other stuff to us. Don't take your foot off the gas pedal there or something like that. But that probably gives them too much agency. Before I want to pick up on something you just said, but before I do, just brief aside, and AI made me think of this. Have you seen the new Avatar? Because I
did. Yes,
how was it?
So I would say it wasn't okay. Yeah. So just a little bit of background for listeners. I was deeply obsessed with the first Avatar, which now I'm like vaguely embarrassed by because somehow Avatar at some point became not cool. But hey, remember back when it first came out, we were all blown away.
I do.
I was.
You
I
were
was
particularly
obsessed.
blown away.
I was. I truly was. Yeah. Zahelu and I See You. I mean, all of
Yep.
that. I was into it. I think I saw the first Avatar 4 times in the theater. I don't know. It touched something deep in me. I'll admit that. I would say the new one is really good. I really liked it. It's not mind blowing in the same way that the first one was, but it is. I mean, it is an amazing visual experience and a technological leap forward. And I do recommend people see it in the theater.
Okay, but you're not running around your apartment with Christmas
No, I'm
lights
not.
and making Zahelu with the microwave
No,
or anything like
no,
that.
I'm not. I'm not.
The joys of youth. Well, let's maybe dive into something a little more nitty gritty before we leave it, which is that you sent me the paper that I guess has become your dissertation, and the most interesting thing you talked about in there to me, and tell me if I'm paraphrasing like years of research for you for like a podcast episode, so I recognize that I'm stepping on something that you've like poured blood, sweat, and tears into. But it seemed like the key takeaway was that like China has not been good at ascending technological value chains for things like semiconductors, things that are dual use, that have a lot of controls or that get governments really anxious. But if you go to, as you said, electric vehicles or some of these other technologies that are arguably more crucial for day-to-day life in a multipolar world where we're not going to be fighting wars, like if you're trying to figure out who's going to have the best economy, who's going to be the most productive, who's going to drive efficiency, things like that, those aren't necessarily the same things as who has the best like automated fighter jet that can like fight everything, right? Like that's a world that seems years down the road, and China has done a really good job at attracting that sort of well, I guess, is it intellectual property theft? Is it is it legal intellectual property transfer? I don't know. But like, I thought that was a really important point, that China actually has conquered some commanding heights of the modern economy based on that. But I'll let you riff a little bit and tell me if I'm getting to the kernel or if I missed like your key insight.
So let me just kind of, by way of clarification, let me just provide a brief summary of what the paper was about. And yeah, as you said, this is what we call in academia the job market paper. So this is the paper that I took on the academic job market with me this fall, which I completed successfully, I'm happy to say. And basically the goal of the paper actually is not to explain, could say, variation in where China actually succeeded in catching up to the frontier. I think that's sort of a separate question, but I have thoughts on that. So I'll come back to that in just a minute. What this paper is really focused on is trying to explain when China actually imposes technology transfer policies. So for listeners who aren't familiar, technology transfer policies are policies that, as the name suggests, facilitate the transfer of technology from one organization, usually a firm, to another. And technology transfer policies played a really important role in China's economic and technological rise over the past 25 years, especially in the decades after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And basically, these are policies that condition foreign firms' ability to invest in China, so foreign market access to the Chinese market, on their willingness to partner with Chinese companies, and through these partnerships, transfer technology and expertise to those Chinese companies. And so what the paper is trying to do is actually say, okay, well, we know these policies matter. One, because they did contribute to China's really remarkable transformation in industries like high-speed rail, various parts of the automotive production sector, various parts of aircraft manufacturing, artificial intelligence. I mean, technology transfer policies really have played a big role. They also really matter because, unfortunately, technology transfer policies have been absolutely central to the collapse in U.S.-China relations in recent years. And here I'll just emphasize that although President Trump's rhetoric around the trade war focused on the trade balance between the U.S. and China, if you actually read the documents that outline why the U.S. government launched the trade war on China, so here I'm thinking the Section 301 investigation report published in March 2018, these documents have nothing to do with the trade balance. The trade balance is not why we launched a trade war on China, nor is it tariffs or even standard non-tariff barriers. We launched a trade war in China because of anger by American multinational corporations that were doing business in China about technology transfer and intellectual property theft. That's what the trade war was about. So these things really matter. We need to understand why they're being, well, basically these things really matter, but we don't know that much about actually when and how China uses them. So the goal of the paper was just to explain when China uses them. And what I found is that there are a lot of industries where China should have used these tools, that we would think of as the definition of strategic high technology industries, like semiconductors, battery and accumulator technology, precision measurement equipment, but I think most importantly, semiconductors, where China basically never uses any kind of formal foreign technology transfer policy. And the question is, why not? And so then I have an argument about China's position in global value chains and how that shapes the bargaining dynamic between China and foreign firms. But the basic goal of the paper was actually not to explain where China actually caught up, because that's kind of a separate question. I mean, there are industries in which, and I think it's important to note that China didn't, and I'm using scare quotes here, China didn't catch up to the world frontier in semiconductors in the sense that now China has its own semiconductor ecosystem that is, equally sophisticated and advanced as the rest of the world. I mean, so obviously in that sense, China did not catch up. But China did make pretty tremendous progress in semiconductors in a lot of ways and in various parts of the supply chain, especially, of course, the lower end parts of the supply chain, testing, packaging, assembly, as well as, parts of semiconductor manufacturing, fabrication. But I think that's kind of a separate question. So I think that there are a lot of reasons that China does, and there are industries where China uses technology transfer policies aggressively where it did catch up, others where it didn't really catch up. So I think that that's kind of a different question. But I think it is important just to state that, and this goes back to the thing you asked earlier around kind of how we gauge China's capabilities now. And I think, and this is where the US government is right. China is a lot more powerful than it was. And the speed with which China caught up to the world frontier is, I think, without precedent. I mean, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in the post-war decades probably came close, but China, it really is an absolutely remarkable world historical story of economic and technological transformation.
So what happens next for China, though? So what do you think about Chinese technological transfer policy going forward? Like, are they not going to be able to use it at all now in the context of the trade war because, the United States has fired that shot? Like, where do they go from here?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what I would say is, unfortunately, I think what we've seen happen is that, and this goes to a question or a point that you made earlier. You asked, is this about intellectual property theft? And the reality is that, of course, yes, intellectual property theft is pervasive and industrial espionage is pervasive, cyber espionage, these things exist, they're real, they are serious problems, as well as, of course, various kinds of informal pressures on foreign companies doing business in China to share technology. These things exist, and I'm sure that the dollar value of that technology leakage is significant. But the important point for observers to remember, especially as we get angry over things like intellectual property theft in China, is that the vast majority of technology transfer to China was done through basically above board, codified, quote unquote, legal channels. So some of these channels were not technically consistent with China's WTO accession protocols, with its agreement, but many of them were. And the reality, though, is that these were things that were done on a more or less voluntary basis. American and other foreign multinational corporations were absolutely desperate to get into the Chinese market in the early 2000s after China joined the World Trade Organization, because understandably, these companies realized that this is going to be the biggest market in human history, and that they had an existential obligation to get a foothold in this market. This is especially important in high technology industries where you have massive economies of scale, which means that you have fierce competition between a small number of very large corporations for marginal global market share. So these companies were absolutely desperate to get into the Chinese market, and China was able to leverage that, as any rational government would, to say, okay, you can enter our market, but in exchange for that, you have to meet these market access conditions. And one of those conditions was partner with a Chinese company in these strategic industries and transfer technology and expertise to your local Chinese partner. So that set of policy tools, I think, is gone, and it's not coming back. So my dissertation project, which I hope will be my first book, is in some ways a piece of historical scholarship, because we're talking about an era that doesn't exist. And it's a unique era that was able to happen because the US was still the unipole, and the U.S. was less concerned. The American government wasn't really involved in regulating this stuff in the early 2000s. These companies were doing this on a company, individual companies negotiating with the Chinese government. And so that's out of the way because the U.S. has ramped up pressure on China. But of course, the reality is that where China needs foreign technology, it's still trying to get that technology. It's just doing it through more and more underground measures. And so I think the irony is that it's precisely the increased U.S. pressure on China that has led to an explosion of intellectual property theft and cyber espionage and things like that, because China no longer can get these technologies through above board channels. It has to go under the table. So these things, though, I think even these measures, which were absolutely rampant in the past 5 years, I think now in certain key technologies like advanced AI chips will become very difficult for China because the US has invested heavily with the export controls in improving essentially state capacity. I mean, the US state's capacity to monitor end users of products containing any form of American intellectual property when it comes to semiconductors. So I don't actually know what the future for China will be in terms of technology transfer. I mean, I think, Chinese officials, Chinese government leaders are extremely creative. I'm sure that they will find ways to continue to gain access to even the most cutting edge AI chips and related technologies. And of course, the point is that for military applications, they don't need to be able to produce these things on a huge, in a huge volume. They need a relatively small number of these things, which they can buy on the black market and install and operate. They don't need to have a TSMC, like advanced, fabrication facility, to be able to produce enough of these to put them in to, drone swarms. I mean, of course, what they need that technology for is commodity production of advanced semiconductor chips. But if that's not their business, then so be it. Meanwhile, they will corner the global electric vehicle market. And for all we know, the global electric vehicle market, and also because the reality is that we just don't know what the future holds in terms of technological progress. So maybe 5 to 10 years from now, quantum computing, which none of us even know what this means exactly, but we have some vague idea that it's out there. And I have at least read suggestions that quantum computing could totally change the game in terms of semiconductor, in terms of our reliance on semiconductors, because it means that we won't need to pack more and more compute onto a smaller and smaller size chip. And in that case, all of this was for naught. It could be the case that 10 years from now, TSMC's entire business model is just totally outdated. I mean, we don't know what the future holds, but I think in the meantime, China will take steps that it can to entrench its position in the technologies where the U.S. hasn't been able to come up with a solid enough national security explanation. I mean, because of course, this is the joke of what the U.S. is doing now. I mean, we are basically throwing around national security to justify controls on companies in China that, I mean, at least everything I'm aware of, these companies are engaged, if not exclusively, almost exclusively in commodity production of chips for the market, for the private market. That we're not talking about companies that are producing advanced AI chips for military applications or even for like humanitarian, human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I think at this point, we're leveraging national security to do everything we can to quell an economic competitor. But I don't think that this is any more about national security in a really meaningful sense.
Well, yeah, you can see that. And, one of I think when the Trump administration wanted to put tariffs on Canadian aluminum, Canada was a threat to U.S. national security, like kind of give me a break. No offense to the Canadians out there. But the other part of this is that like, you mentioned sort of China having a domestic, semiconductor ecosystem. No country has a domestic semiconductor ecosystem that works. Like we might be a little bit better on certain things than China, but they're also better at things like, and I think the things that the United States is better at or that the Dutch are better at are harder to replicate for China. But all that packaging, assembly, things like that doesn't happen in the United States. This is sort of
fabrication doesn't really meaningfully happen in the United States anymore, except for Intel. But Intel, my understanding is Intel has made a series of very bad decisions in recent years and have really fallen behind. I mean, even on fabrication, I don't think that they've broken past 14 nanometers yet. So, and of course, TSMC and Samsung are opening facilities here, but I mean, TSMC, and more importantly, Taiwan, I mean, Taiwan knows that TSMC is the golden goose for them. I mean, or the goose that lays the golden egg. I mean, they're not about to allow the U.S. to steal major TSMC production capabilities from Taiwan. And I think same for Korea vis-a-vis Samsung. I mean, TSMC, I think, is something like 8% of TSMC sales are 8% of Taiwan's GDP.
Yeah. I mean,
I think Samsung has got to be like equivalent to probably 15% of South Korea's entire GDP.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'll get you out of here on this question, which is we hear so much about TSMC and Taiwan, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see China invading Taiwan anytime soon. It's going to be the Hong Kong playbook. They're not even close from a capability perspective, even considering. But I think that's the thing that's being lost in all of this is that what is South Korea going to do? Because the United States seems to have gotten some success in pressuring the Dutch, pressuring the Japanese, and coming on to let's create this, semiconductor ecosystem that excludes China. South Korea, as far as I know, hasn't signed on. And South Korea, generally speaking, looks more towards Beijing in the grand scope of history. And it seems to be sitting there sort of out in the middle. So I just wonder if you have a view on sort of China, South Korea. I was much more worried about this before South Korea's new government, which is nominally pro-U.S., but they also won by the skin of their teeth. So I just wonder how you think about South Korea and sort of this grand, because it seems to me they have a big role to play in this and that nobody's really talking about them in the West.
That's a good question. And I'm going to have to punt a little bit because I don't have, I mean, basically what I'll say, I'll offer like my Punt
eloquently. Nobody punts as eloquently as...
Yeah, sure. Informed / marginally uninformed thoughts on South Korea. But basically, yeah, I think it is, I think South Korea has always, as you suggest, it's always tried to balance between the U.S. and China in a way that Japan hasn't. And Japan's facing a different kind of set of strategic parameters than South Korea is. I think, China is an absolutely massive market for Samsung and for other South Korean chip producers, and also is a massive production base for Samsung. In fact, Shanxi province, where Xi Jinping has part of his political roots, are in Shanxi province, and Samsung has massive production facilities there. So I think that South Korea will continue to hew towards a middle road position. I think a lot kind of depends on how things develop in the semiconductor market. I think Samsung already this year, it in itself has made a few, and I don't know the details of this, but it made some missteps when it comes to fabrication at the cutting edge. And so Samsung is losing market share at the leading edge to TSMC. TSMC already had 90% market share. I think it's growing. Samsung, still has, I think, dominant market share in memory chips DRAM memory chips, I guess, or maybe NAND. I can't remember exactly, but I think that I wouldn't expect to see South Korea sign on to the U.S. export control agenda in the way that, Japan has been. And I think part of this, though, is because I think that Samsung is more powerful vis-a-vis the South Korean government than any given Japanese producer is vis-a-vis the Japanese government. And this is why I think also, I know that there have been hints that the Netherlands is going to sign on to a more expansive version of the export controls, limiting not only EUV, which of course is already controlled, but DUV, which I guess is not yet controlled. But even that, I don't know, because, and this comes, I don't have a good sense of internal, Dutch politics, but I would imagine that ASML has a similar level of sway over the Netherlands government, because part of this is you've got like a monopoly player in ASML, the same way you've got something like a monopoly player in Samsung that's able to overcome any kind of collective action problem to lobbying the government for policies that are favorable to it. And the reality is that none of these companies want to be cut off from China. They all want to sell. Intel doesn't want to be cut off from China. Yeah. Intel wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants the subsidies and it wants the exemptions from the various export controls so it can continue to sell, some of its chips to China. But yeah, just long story short, I think South Korea, I am less, optimistic. I have lower expectations in terms of the actual level of buy-in the U.S. is going to get on the export controls, plurilateral or multilateral buy-in, from even Japan and the Netherlands. And I think beyond that, South Korea is an even harder sell. And I think, beyond that, Taiwan is also a very difficult sell. So that would be my 2 cents.
Okay. Well, in that case, John, let's not wait another year and a half to have you back on the podcast. We'll get you back on soon, okay?
This is great. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.